The raw, unnatural orange of the traffic cones was the first thing to assault the senses. A belligerent gash of color, slicing through the serene morning green of Oak Creek Estates. They stood in a hostile, unwavering line, a plastic army choking the life out of the otherwise peaceful tree-lined sidewalk. The morning sun, still low and gentle, cast long, elegant shadows from the manicured oaks, but even its golden light couldn't soften the aggressive chemical glare of the cones. They seemed to hum with a furious purpose. "Get off the sidewalk. This is private property." The voice was a shard of glass thrown into the quiet morning air, shattering the calm. It belonged to a woman standing on a lawn so perfectly uniformly green, it looked like astroturf. Her arms were crossed so tightly, it seemed a monumental physical effort, just to contain the sheer volume of her own indignation. She wore a pristine pink tracksuit that matched the prize-winning roses blooming beside her porch. Her face, framed by a helmet of immaculate blonde hair, was a mask of furious, unshakable certainty. Alex, the target of her shriek, slowed his rhythmic, ground-eating jog to a halt, his breathing remaining controlled and deep, despite the sudden shock of the confrontation. Sweat beaded on his forehead and trickled down his temples, stinging his eyes. He pulled a single earbud out, the mellow conversational rhythm of a history podcast, dissolving instantly into the tense, unpleasant reality of the moment. "I'm sorry," he asked, his voice deliberately, even, and calm, a stark contrast to her piercing, accusatory tone. He stood his ground, not wanting to give her the satisfaction of seeing him retreat. "You heard me?" The woman snapped, taking a proprietary step forward onto the very sidewalk she was claiming as her own. Her automated sprinkler system hissed behind her, a loyal mechanical guard dog, standing sentry over her meticulously cultivated domain. "This sidewalk is for residents enjoying a peaceful walk, not for illegal racing. You people are a menace to this community." Alex glanced down the empty, sun-dappled stretch of concrete, then back at her, a flicker of genuine disbelief in his eyes. He was the only person in sight. "Ma'am, I'm just going for a run," he stated simply. "I live 2 streets over on Chestnut Lane." He gestured vaguely in the direction of his new house, the one he'd poured his life savings and all his fragile hopes for a quiet future into just 3 months ago. "I don't care if you live in the governor's mansion," she said, her voice dripping with a carefully cultivated disdain that she likely practiced in the mirror. "You are using our community paths as your personal racetrack. It is a liability. It is dangerous." She gestured dramatically at the unwavering line of cones, as if they were a police barricade protecting the public from a bomb threat. "I have taken appropriate measures to ensure the safety of our residents." A small, bitter laugh escaped Alex's lips before he could stop it. The sheer absurdity of the situation was overwhelming. "Measures? You've blocked a public right-of-way with traffic cones you bought at a hardware store." He took a single deliberate step closer, his 6-foot frame towering over her, but he was careful to keep his tone measured. "This is a public sidewalk. It is for everyone, ma'am. Not for your kind of aggressive activity," she insisted, her chin jutting out pugnaciously. "I am on the HOA board. I am the head of the Beautification and Safety Committee. I know the bylaws front to back, and I will enforce them." Alex felt a familiar, profound weariness settle over him, a weight far heavier than any physical exhaustion from his run. He had moved to the suburbs, seeking peace, a quiet place to heal, a place to train, a place to try and outrun the ghosts of the past year. He didn't have the energy for a pre-dawn fight with a self-appointed neighborhood tyrant before he'd even had his first cup of coffee. He simply wanted to finish his 5 miles, a small daily promise he'd made to himself. It was a promise he had made to his late father. His father had been a runner. Every single morning, whether it was raining, snowing, or brilliantly sunny, he had laced up his worn-out running shoes and hit the pavement. It was his meditation, his therapy, his way of greeting the day and wrestling it into submission. Alex remembered with a sudden, painful clarity that felt like a punch to the gut one specific Saturday morning years ago. He'd been a moody 15-year-old, dragged out of his warm bed to join his dad on a crisp autumn run through a park ablaze with fall colors. He had complained bitterly for the entire first mile, whining about the cold, his tired legs, the sheer pointlessness of it all. Then his father had slowed, turning to him, not with annoyance, but with a wide, genuine grin that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "It's not about the speed, son," he'd said, his breath fogging in the chilly air. "It's about this. Just this. The air in your lungs, the ground under your feet. It's the one part of the day you absolutely can't get wrong." After the cancer took him swift and brutal and merciless, Alex had found a strange, desperate solace in that same ritual. The rhythmic pounding of his feet on the pavement was a connection, a continuation of a conversation that had been cut brutally short. He was training for the city marathon, planning to run it in his father's memory, to raise money for the hospice that had cared for him with such profound dignity in his final painful days. Each mile was a prayer, each bead of sweat a tribute. This quiet morning ritual was sacred ground. And this woman with her pristine pink tracksuit and her ridiculous plastic cones was desecrating it. He looked at her, truly, looked at her, at the perfectly coiffed hair, the expensive, immaculate landscaping, the little brass plaque by her rose bushes that read, "The Petersons." Carol Peterson. He'd heard the name whispered by his more friendly neighbors, usually accompanied by a resigned sigh or a dramatic, long-suffering eye roll. "Look, Mrs. Peterson." He began, consciously trying a different tack, a more conciliatory, neighborly one. "I am not racing anyone. I run at a very steady pace. I am always careful to move for pedestrians, though there are never any out here at this hour. There is really no need for this. The need is determined by the committee which, as I've mentioned, I chair," she said, her voice as cold and final as a judge's gavel. "Use the street if you absolutely must, but the sidewalks are for tranquil enjoyment." She turned her back on him, then a clear and absolute dismissal of his entire existence. She began to inspect one of her prize-winning rose bushes, plucking an imaginary imperfection from a leaf, as if he had already vanished into thin air. Alex stood there for a long, silent moment, the blood pounding in his ears. The quiet tranquility of his morning, the sacred space he had carved out for himself and his memories, was shattered. He could step onto the street and dodge the early morning commuter cars. He could turn back defeated and let her win. Or he could make a stand. He looked at the cones, a ridiculous, pointless barrier erected by one person's fragile, overinflated ego. He sighed a plume of steamy air in the cool morning. He turned and jogged back the way he came, his rhythm broken, his mind churning with a potent cocktail of anger and frustration. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The next morning the cones were back, but they had been reinforced. They seemed more numerous, more defiant. Laminated signs, professionally printed and glistening with dew, had been zip-tied to each one. They read in an aggressive, bold all-caps font, "No unauthorized recreational running. Violators will be fined in accordance with HOA bylaw 7-4." Alex stared at the sign, a slow, hot burn of anger starting deep in his chest. Bylaw 7.4. He had read the entire HOA covenant from cover to cover before signing the mountain of paperwork for his house. He was a lawyer, for God's sake. He knew for a fact that there was no Bylaw 7.4 that said anything of the sort. The real Bylaw 7.4 was a mundane, forgettable rule about the proper placement of garbage and recycling cans on collection day. She wasn't just interpreting the rules. She was inventing them. Blatantly and arrogantly inventing them, assuming no one would bother to check. This time he didn't hesitate for a second. He jogged up to the first cone, and without breaking stride kicked it over. It skittered across the concrete with a hollow, immensely satisfying plastic clatter. He kicked the next one, and the next, clearing a path for himself down the center of the sidewalk. It was a small, petty act of rebellion, but it felt like a righteous one. He hadn't gone 20 yards when her front door flew open with a bang, that echoed in the quiet air. Vandalism assault on community property. I'm calling the police. I'm filming this. You are a menace. Carol Peterson stood on her porch phone, held high and steady in both hands. Its camera lens, a single, cold, judgmental eye. I am a private citizen being threatened. I need an officer at 12 Maple Avenue immediately. Send help! She shrieked into the phone, her voice pitched for maximum drama. A police cruiser. He hadn't actually expected that. Alex felt a jolt of adrenaline, cold and sharp, that was completely different from the warm burn of his run. This was a serious, dangerous escalation. He slowed to a walk, his heart hammering against his ribs, and turned to face her just as a squad car rounded the corner. Its lights were not flashing, but its mere presence on the sleepy suburban street was overwhelmingly official and ominous. The officer, a man with a calm, tired face that suggested he'd seen it all, got out of the car slowly. He surveyed the scene with a practiced, sweeping gaze, the toppled cones scattered like bowling pins. Carol on her porch, in a state of high dudgeon, and Alex standing in the middle of the sidewalk, sweating in his running gear, looking very much like the accused. "Ma'am, sir, what seems to be the problem here this morning?" The officer asked, his voice studiously neutral. The problem, officer, Carol declared, marching down her perfectly manicured lawn to meet him, phone still recording. "Is this man. He is destroying private property, HOA property, and threatening the peace and safety of our entire neighborhood." The officer turned his patient gaze to Alex. "Sir, your side of the story." Alex took a deep, steadying breath, fighting to keep his voice from shaking with anger. This was a cross-examination he had never prepared for. "Officer, my name is Alex Ryder. I'm a resident here. I live on Chestnut. This woman has illegally obstructed a public sidewalk. The signs she posted cite a completely non-existent bylaw. I was simply clearing the illegal obstruction so I could continue my run." "He's a lawyer." Carol sneered from the side as if it were the foulest of epithets. "He thinks he can twist words and do whatever he wants. He's arrogant." The officer's gaze lingered on Alex, his expression unreadable. "Is that true, sir? Are you an attorney?" "Yes, I am." Alex said, his frustration growing. "Which is precisely why I know that blocking a public right-of-way is a misdemeanor in this state, and her signs constitute fraudulent misrepresentation. Legally, I was well within my rights to remove the obstruction." He sounded confident, clinical, but inside his stomach was churning. He was being interrogated on a public sidewalk over a handful of cheap plastic cones. The humiliation was acute, a burning shame that spread across his face. He could feel the eyes of hidden neighbors peering from behind their blinds. The officer sighed, the long, drawn-out sound of a man who desperately wished he were back at the station with a hot cup of coffee. "Ma'am, with all due respect, technically, this is a public sidewalk. You can't legally block it off like this." He then turned his attention back to Alex. "And sir, with all due respect to you, kicking things over isn't the most constructive way to resolve a civil dispute. It can be seen as a provocative act, which can lead to other problems." "So, what am I supposed to do?" Alex asked, the frustration finally cracking through his carefully maintained composure. "Just let her turn the entire neighborhood into her own personal fiefdom." "For now," the officer said, his tone shifting from mediation to a quiet, firm warning. "I suggest you both go back to your respective homes and let the HOA sort it out through its proper channels. No more calls to 911 unless there is a genuine life-threatening emergency. Is that understood?" Carol glared, her lips a thin white line, but she nodded stiffly. Alex nodded too, his jaw so tight it ached. The officer got back in his car and drove away, leaving a thick, unresolved, and deeply hostile tension in his wake. Alex's run was ruined. His sanctuary now felt unmistakably like a battlefield. Later that day, the email arrived. It was sent to the entire Oak Creek homeowners mailing list from Carol Peterson in her official capacity as chair of the Beautification and Safety Committee. It was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive rhetoric, now bolstered and legitimized by her encounter with law enforcement. Subject: an urgent note on community safety and aggressive behavior. Dear neighbors, it has come to my attention that certain individuals have continued to misuse our beautiful and peaceful walking paths for high-impact aggressive activities. This disturbing behavior has now escalated to include acts of vandalism against community safety equipment and intimidating behavior toward fellow residents, which unfortunately necessitated police intervention this morning in order to de-escalate a volatile situation. While we encourage a healthy lifestyle, these aggressive actions present a significant safety risk to our more vulnerable residents, our children, and our elderly. Please be reminded that our sidewalks are for the peaceful enjoyment of all. Let us work together to keep Oak Creek the serene and safe haven we all chose as our home. Sincerely, Carol Peterson, Chair, B&S Committee. Alex's hands clenched into white-knuckled fists as he read and reread the email. Police intervention. Volatile situation. She had expertly twisted the narrative to paint him as a dangerous, unhinged criminal. The fallout was no longer subtle. It was immediate and chilling. The curt nod from the man who walked his golden retriever was now a full-on hostile glare. A woman pulling out of her driveway in a luxury SUV saw him walking and pointedly waited for him to pass her lips, pressed into a thin, disapproving line. He was being judged and convicted in the court of neighborhood opinion. As he walked home, defeated and furious, he saw a teenage girl tacking a brightly colored flyer to the community notice board near the mailboxes. It featured a cartoon dog wearing a running bib and a goofy grin. "Pause for a cause charity fun run," it proclaimed in bubbly letters. He felt a faint pang of interest. A distant memory of charity runs his father used to participate in, but his mind was too clouded with anger and the sting of social ostracization to give it more than a passing dismissive thought. The next morning, he knew he couldn't let it go. He couldn't let her win. He needed his run. He needed to reclaim that small, sacred piece of his life from her tyrannical grip. He laced up his shoes, his stomach tight with a mixture of dread and defiance, and headed out into the cool morning air. The cones were gone. For a moment, a wave of profound relief washed over him. Maybe the police officer's warning had actually worked. Maybe she had finally listened to reason. But as he rounded the corner onto Maple Avenue, his hope evaporated. She was there. And this time, she wasn't alone. She was standing with two other residents, a beefy, red-faced man, and a woman with an equally severe expression. The three of them were spread out, blocking the path like a human wall. "There he is," Carol said, her voice dripping with a venomous satisfaction. "The one who thinks the rules don't apply to him." The beefy man, who looked like he spent his weekends polishing a collection of power tools, took a step forward. "We're the neighborhood watch," he said, puffing out his chest in a sad display of machismo. "Carol told us all about you. We don't tolerate troublemakers and vandals here." "I'm not a troublemaker," Alex said, stopping a few feet away, his hands held loosely at his sides. "I'm your neighbor. I am just trying to go for a run." "Not here. You're not," the other woman chimed in, crossing her arms in a mirror image of Carol. "This is a quiet family street." The man stepped closer, deliberately invading Alex's personal space, his breath smelling of stale coffee. "Maybe you didn't hear her. You should turn around and go back where you came from before there's a real problem." He punctuated his sentence by giving Alex a hard, unexpected shove in the center of his chest. Instinct, raw and primal, flared hot and white in Alex's mind. His body tensed, years of forgotten high school wrestling moves flashing through his thoughts. He could drop this man in a second. But as he looked past the man's smug face, he saw it Carol and the other woman had their phones out, recording their expressions, a mixture of fear and smug expectation. They wanted him to react. They were baiting him into an assault charge. "Hey, what in the hell is going on here?" A new voice, sharp and angry cut through the tense standoff. It was the man with the golden retriever, Mr. Gable. He was standing on the edge of his lawn, his dog whining softly and pulling at its leash, sensing the ugly confrontation. "Stay out of this," George Carroll snapped, not taking her eyes off Alex. "This is official HOA business. Looks more like bullying and assault to me, mister," Gable retorted, walking closer, his presence immediately changing the dynamic. 3-on-1. Really, Carroll? Have you lost your mind? The scene instantly devolved into a chaotic, messy shouting match with Carroll's two allies yelling at Mr. Gable, and Carroll continuing to berate Alex. Alex stood frozen in the middle of it, all the spot on his chest, where he'd been shoved, still burning the entire neighborhood, now peering from behind their pristine plantation-shuttered windows. This was it. This was the absolute final straw. He turned without another word and walked away from the screaming match, pulling out his phone. He had tried to be reasonable. He had tried to be tough. Now he would be strategic. He found the number for the HOA's management company. "Mr. Henderson, my name is Alex Ryder. We need to call an emergency meeting of the board. I am filing a formal complaint against Carol Peterson for harassment slander, and now for orchestrating a physical assault against me by members of her so-called neighborhood watch." The community center's small meeting room was stuffy and smelled faintly of stale coffee and industrial-strength cleaner. The air crackled with a tense, expectant energy that was almost a physical presence. All 5 HOA board members were present, seated around a long, scarred folding table. A dozen other residents, including a still fuming Mr. Gable, lined the back wall, drawn by the undeniable scent of drama. Alex sat quietly in a plastic chair in the corner. He saw the girl from the notice board, the Pause for a Cause girl, sitting in the front row, looking pale and profoundly nervous. He gave her a small, encouraging nod, wondering what she was doing in this viper's pit. Carol Peterson swept in last 5 minutes, late, radiating an aura of absolute, unassailable confidence. She placed a thick, expensive-looking leather portfolio on the table with a decisive, echoing thud. "Thank you for calling this emergency session." David Carroll began addressing the HOA president, a weary-looking man named Henderson. "I'm glad we can finally address the escalating issue of public nuisance vandalism and aggression in our community." She opened her portfolio. "I have evidence that will make the board's decision very simple and very clear." She nodded curtly to her beefy ally from the sidewalk, who dimmed the lights and turned on a projector that hummed to life. A video played on the pull-down screen. It was the footage from her phone, but it was cleverly and maliciously edited. It showed Alex kicking the first cone, but the clip was slowed down, looped 3 times, and paired with a menacing bass-heavy sound effect that she must have added. It completely cut out the context of the long line of other cones and his steady jogging pace, making it look like a singular violent and unprovoked outburst of rage. As you can see, Carol said, her voice as smooth and cool as silk, "Mr. Ryder has a clear and demonstrable anger management problem. This is an unprovoked act of destruction against community property. I move that he be fined the maximum amount allowable under our bylaws and be issued a formal restraining order from the Beautification and Safety Committee for my own protection." The board members murmured amongst themselves. They looked at the damning video, then at Alex, their expressions shifting from neutral to concerned. He felt a cold, sick dread creep up his spine. She was going to win. This slick, manipulative presentation was working. "This is very concerning," one of the board members said, frowning at Alex. "That looks quite aggressive." "Actually, Carol, Mr. Henderson interrupted, his voice gentle but firm, as he reached over and turned the lights back on. "That's not the primary reason we're here tonight." Carol's eyes narrowed. "It's not, no. We're here to discuss the formal complaint of harassment, slander, and assault that has been filed against you." He gestured with an open hand toward Alex. "By Mr. Ryder." Carol's head whipped around and she stared at Alex, her expression a mixture of pure shock and incandescent fury. Him. He's the criminal. You saw the video, Carol, please, Mr. Henderson said. He picked up a sheet of paper from the table in front of him. Let's talk about a different matter for a moment. You recently voted to approve the Pause for a Cause charity run scheduled for this Saturday, correct? A flicker of confusion crossed Carol's face. Of course I did. It's for a good cause. What does that have to do with this? This hooligan, she spat, pointing a trembling finger at Alex. Perhaps everything, Mr. Henderson said softly. He then turned his kind attention to the pale, nervous girl in the front row. Emily, could you please tell the board a little bit about the event you've been organizing? The girl stood up, her hands twisting in her lap. It was the girl from the notice board. And as she stood, Alex realized with a jolt that she had Carol's eyes. It was her daughter. It's a fun run, she said, her voice barely a whisper. To raise money for the Elmwood Animal Shelter. They're a no-kill shelter, and they need a lot of money for food and medicine for the animals. Carol stared at her daughter, a dawning, sputtering horror spreading across her features, chasing away the anger. Emily, what are you? The runners you were yelling at. Carol, Mr. Henderson continued, his voice quiet, but relentless. The illegal racers you sicked your neighborhood watch on. They were likely participants, supporters of your daughter's cause practicing the route. The man you called a hooligan was running to honor his late father and training for a marathon to raise money for hospice care. The room was utterly deathly silent. The only sound was the low hum of the projector fan. Carol's face had gone from pink to a ghostly, bloodless white. She looked from Mr. Henderson to Alex, and then finally her gaze landed on her daughter. Emily's eyes were wide with a devastating, dawning comprehension. She was looking at her mother as if for the very first time. The signs, the cones, the angry emails, the confrontations. It all clicked into place in her mind, with an audible, shattering crack. The people who called the school to complain. Emily whispered, her voice cracking with the unbearable weight of the realization. The runners who dropped out because they said they were being harassed in the neighborhood by some crazy lady with cones. That was you. Before Carol could formulate a denial, Mr. Gable, the dog walker, stood up from the back of the room. His face was grim. President Henderson. May I say something? Please, George. Emily, he said, his voice full of regret. I was one of those people who called you. I told you some woman on Maple was trying to sabotage your run. I am so sorry. I had no idea it was your own mother. The shame on Carol's face was now a palpable, toxic force in the room, so thick you could taste it. The signs, Emily's voice rose, filled with a raw, heartbreaking anguish. The ones that said, no unauthorized racing, Mom. That was my race. That was for the puppies. You tried to stop it. Tears began to stream down her face, silent and full of betrayal. Why would you do that to me? I was protecting you. Carol finally burst out a desperate, defensive, pathetic cry. I was protecting our neighborhood. I was protecting our property values. I didn't know. You didn't know, Emily interrupted, her voice gaining a sudden, devastating strength, born of pure heartbreak. She reached into her school bag and pulled out a crumpled, colorful flyer. The Pause for a Cause flyer. I put one of these on every single door on this street, including Mr. Ryder's. She turned her tear-streaked face to Alex. I saw you running every morning. You looked like a serious runner. I even left a little handwritten note with the flyer on your door. I thought you might want to help. That was the final brutal blow. The man she had targeted, vilified, slandered, and assaulted wasn't a random menace. He was an invited guest, a potential champion for her own daughter's cause, handpicked by the very person she claimed to be protecting. Carol Peterson sank back into her chair, utterly and completely defeated. Her carefully constructed reality of order and control of rules and regulations had crumbled into dust around her. Her portfolio lay forgotten. The doctored video was just a monument to her own folly. Mr. Henderson let the heavy silence hang for a moment before clearing his throat. The board has reviewed the complaint and the evidence, he announced to the quiet room. It is clear that Mrs. Peterson has acted far outside of her authority, misrepresented HOA bylaws, and harassed residents. Furthermore, she has actively and maliciously undermined a community-sanctioned event. Therefore, I move for an immediate vote to remove Carol Peterson from the Beautification and Safety Committee, and from all other committee positions permanently. Seconded, Mr. Gable said loudly and clearly from the back of the room. All in favor. 4 hands went up without a moment's hesitation. The day of the charity run was beautiful. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless, hopeful blue. The belligerent orange cones were gone, replaced by cheerful, colorful balloons, and handmade signs that read, "Go Runners," and "Run for the Pause." The whole neighborhood had turned out. The sidewalks were thronged with people, families with strollers, kids on bikes, and dozens of runners pinning on their race numbers. The atmosphere was joyful, a celebration not just of a good cause, but of a community reclaiming its spirit from the grip of one person's fear. Alex ran the pavement, feeling light and responsive beneath his feet. He wasn't running from anything today. He was running toward something, toward a sense of belonging, of community. As he rounded the final corner onto Maple Avenue, he saw Emily at the finish line, handing out water bottles and beaming her face alight with pure, unadulterated joy. He crossed the line breathless and smiling. As he took a cup of water from her, he glanced up at the Peterson house. For a fleeting, poignant second, he saw a figure in the upstairs window. It was Carol. She stood a silhouette behind the pristine curtains, her hand pressed flat against the glass, watching the vibrant celebration she had tried so desperately to prevent. Then, the figure stepped back, disappearing into the deep, lonely shadows of her perfect house. That evening, Alex sat in his quiet study, the scent of fresh-cut grass drifting in through the open window. He opened a small, dark wooden box on his desk. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded, worn-out blue velvet, was his father's old marathon medal from a race he'd run decades ago. It was tarnished and heavy, and felt wonderfully solid in his palm. He held it, the cool metal, a comforting, tangible weight. He had found his peace not in the absence of conflict, but in the strength to stand his ground for something sacred, and in the quiet power of a community that, when tested, had ultimately chosen kindness and unity over fear and control. The echo of the drama remained a quiet reminder of the battle fought and won, but the air was clear and the road ahead was open.